Hey, how's it going, everybody? I am Indypride from Milk and Cookies Total War with another Warhammer lore, army, and tactics video. Welcome back. It's been a while. This time we're covering the Chaos Dwarfs of Zharr Naggrund, an ancient, malevolent group of steampunk demon binders in love with fire, bulls, slavery, and Babylonian hats. This video will cover Chaos Dwarf lore, their army compositions and tactics, and how they might translate into Total War Warhammer. So as usual, the questions I'll be looking to answer include: who are the Chaos Dwarfs? Where do they come from? Why are they important in the Warhammer world? And what characterizes them as a faction? We've covered the Lizardmen, we've covered the Wood Elves and the Tomb Kings and the Dark Elves, but now we're getting into Game 3 information. Uncharted territory, as it were. As the map moves further east and into the Darklands and the Mountains of Morn, we start talking about races that weren't so loved by Games Workshop, but will likely see a massive resurgence as they're thrust back into the spotlight for Game 3 of the trilogy. These races weren't squatted, they weren't left to rot in the dungeons of forgotten lore to the extent some of the earlier races were, like the Fimir, but certainly they were not given the same love or attention as the Empire or the Elves, Chaos, or even the Undead of Nagakara. They are considered one of the 16 major Warhammer fantasy battle races, but made comparatively few appearances in the novels and simply have less written about them overall. And instead of receiving an updated 8th edition army book from Games Workshop themselves, the Dawi Zharr were fleshed out in a Forge World supplement book called Tamurkhan, the Throne of Chaos, the story of a battle royale between the chosen of each Chaos god to gain demonhood and eternal dominion over the planet. Now, Forge World was a subsidiary of Games Workshop that created their own high-quality models and rule sets, so alongside the information that Norska will soon be playable and have access to some of their own Forge World models, namely the Skin Wolves and Fimir Warriors, it's confirmed now that Creative Assembly has the ability to add Forge World content in general, not just units and models, but entire races as well, which is incredibly good news for this trilogy. But with all that said, let's talk about the Chaos Dwarfs, the Dawi Zharr, their lore, their army roster, battlefield tactics, legendary lord choices, and ultimately how they could be implemented in Total War Warhammer in a flavorful and fun way that differentiates them from the other playable races. The Chaos Dwarfs are essentially a terrifying reflection of what the Dwarfs of the Kara's Anchor could have become had their circumstances been just a little different. They're similar in so many ways: their short, stocky stature, rippling with muscle, their resilience and physical hardiness, their industrious nature and love of technology, and their desire to create, to craft and build, to shape incredible works from simple raw materials and share them with the world. Where the Dwarfs of the World's Edge Mountains, those under Thorgrim Grudgebear and Unkrim Ironfist and Khazad-dûr Dragonslayer, crafted majestic thrones and jewel-encrusted decorations to adorn their great halls and demonstrate the power and culture of their race, the Chaos Dwarfs bent their work solely towards malice and weaponry and the destruction of lesser races. They shared a very different kind of culture with the world, one of slavery, one of death, and smoke-belching monstrosities bound to demonic entities that screeched and wailed and echoed the torture millions of damned souls have endured in the warp throughout the eons. Over the course of hundreds, even thousands of years, their interactions with the stuff of chaos slowly twisted their bodies and their minds. They grew tusks and horns and wicked sharp teeth, and they grew hateful, and they grew evil, with a rampant desire to control flame and the hellish forces that rested beneath their very feet. Their military strategies combine overwhelming ranged warfare and terrifying steampunk creations with fire sorcery and demonic summons forged of pure molten lava and raging hot metal. And their armor and weaponry is amongst the finest in the world, ensorcelled by Hashut the Bull God, father of darkness and patron deity of the Dawi Zharr. If you're a fan of sitting back and unleashing carnage from afar with massive artillery pieces that cause earthquakes, pitch black locomotives equipped with gigantic cannons and small arms weaponry, or guns that shoot literal lava, the Chaos Dwarfs are the race for you. They have an incredible assortment of powerful toys to play with, and we haven't even begun talking about their monstrous or infantry choices yet. Without a doubt, one of the more unique and flavorful races in all of Warhammer Fantasy. But let's talk about their story, which begins with the Dwarfen diaspora, the great Dawi migration throughout the World's Edge Mountains and into the lands beyond. As we know, almost from their very inception in the mind's eye of the Old Ones, the Dwarfs loved mining. They loved the underground and the crafting of precious metals and minerals into weapons of war and symbols of power and prestige. and so from their ancestral home, somewhere in the Southlands, perhaps near the long-lost hold of Karak-Zorn, they migrated northwards along the positively gigantic mountain range, establishing holds and growing fabulously wealthy as clans mined Gromril and gemstones. As time went on, this burgeoning empire would come to be known as the Karaz Angkor, the Everlasting Realm, and at its peak, stretched throughout the entirety of the World's Edge Mountains. But some dwarfs, particularly adventurous ones, felt an urge to travel east, and after some time, reached a dim and desolate plateau they called Zorn Uzkul, the Great Skull Land. The place was barren, dusty, pockmarked with craters and riddled with lava flows, and littered with the skulls and bones of ancient dead. But it was rich in minerals. The land itself was teeming with the metals and gems that could form an empire. So some clans stayed, and mined, and began a new life amidst the volcanic desert. Others felt the land was accursed, and left, but despite their differences on opinion, and distances between them and the other holds, they kept close ties of kinship and continued their trade for centuries. That was until, as we've learned in so many other Warhammer videos, the time of chaos came to the world, and it made a glorious mess of things. Families, clans, and entire races were sundered, millions died, and the great chaos incursion left its indelible mark on the world. While the lizardmen and high elves fought tooth and claw and pointy hat for Ulthuan and Lustria, the dwarfs of the Karaz Angkor looked to their own defense as demons invaded. Earthquakes shattered untold numbers of holds, cutting Karaks off from each other, and malevolent beings stirred in their depths. As chaos spread its tendrils, the dwarfs of Zorn Uzkul were cut off and surrounded, and they lost all contact with the outside world for centuries. Understandably, the dwarfs believed their eastern cousins dead. After all, how could they survive cut off from the might of the Everlasting Realm? An ironic name, of course, given the fate that befell it. But no one knows what nameless horrors besieged the eastern dwarfs, what depths they were forced to sink to in search of survival, but make no mistake, they were facing Armageddon. It's not a huge leap to believe that cannibalism, demonic pacts, and unholy alliances utterly unbecoming of dwarfs and those who worship the ancient ancestor gods became a daily part of their struggle. They were almost completely destroyed, faced with unspeakable destruction and the annihilation of their people. But throughout it, they persisted. Through sheer willpower and hate, they survived. The dwarfs made it out the other side, but they were now and forever irrevocably changed. Chaos marks us all, and it certainly marked the Chaos Dwarfs. There's this misconception that dwarfs are immune to the effects of chaos, that they simply cannot be turned, only killed. But the Dawi Zharr are living proof of that falsehood. They are unusually resilient to influence from the warp, a product of their stubbornness, and perhaps a blessing from the old ones. But those long, chaotic years took their toll, and the Dawi that emerged from that winter of woe were malicious and cunning, twisted in mind and twisted in body, with protruding horns and tusks and eyes of pure crimson, filled with unadulterated hate. They were pitiless, cold-hearted creatures, obsessed with death, and consumed with a need to enslave and dominate everyone and everything they came into contact with. And as you'd imagine, in such a brutal world, that had its advantages. Over time, they slowly rebuilt their fortresses and factories in their new image, a land of corruption and dark factories spewing alchemical fury and belching molten rock, forging weapons of war with which to carve out a new empire. Slavery and faith in the Dark Father would be the foundations upon which this empire was built. It was during the demonic incursion that runesmiths of the clans had called out to the void for help, sending messages into the warp that they didn't fully understand in the depths of their desperation. And they received an answer from a malign being who promised to see them through those dark days, should they grant him their unyielding loyalty. With little choice and little time, they agreed, and Hashut, Father of Darkness, became the patron god of the Chaos Dwarfs. Now obviously, this pact was not without consequence. It essentially cursed their race for all time. By the time the pact was sealed, it seemed a small price to pay for survival. The alternative was Slaneshi butt stuff or cornate savagery and mutilation for an eternity in the warp. Not a very hard choice. Represented as a great blazing bull wreathed in smoke and shadow, Hashut was the tyranny, the hatred, the resilience, and the greed of the Dawi Zharr made manifest, and as is common with every other chaos god and greater demon, these emotions and acts gave him power. The runesmiths that first made contact with him became the new priesthood, a convocation of sorcerer priests who quickly took control of this new society through arcane power granted by their deity. And this is one of the major differences between the dwarfs and the Chaos Dwarfs. While the Dawi are physically and fundamentally incapable of perceiving or channeling the winds of magic, the Dawi Zharr gained the ability to wield flame and ash in a similar but darker and more brutal version of the Wind of Akshi, the Lore of Fire. At the end of the day, though, spells from both lores will generally end up with their victim screaming and on fire, so not really that different in the grand scheme of things. But this new cast of sorcerers and demonsmiths, who essentially combine the forging and binding talents of runesmiths with the arcane power of battle wizards, quickly became the ruling class. Which shouldn't really come as a surprise. That's an incredibly potent combination. The ability to supply bodyguards and allies with demon-bound weapons and armor while burning your enemies to a cinder. Their first edict was to construct the great city of Naggrund, the city of fire and desolation. At the center, they planned a massive obsidian tower shaped like a ziggurat, and at its top, they would erect a great altar to their god. But they needed a workforce, and this was a big problem for them, right? They had just come out of one of the darkest periods imaginable, lost much of their population, and it's not like they had been incredibly numerous to begin with, so they needed beings to do their dirty work for them. After all, they hadn't endured a demonic invasion and been blessed by, for all intents and purposes, a chaos god, just so they would have to work their fingers to the bone and, actually build cities themselves. I mean, that would just be preposterous. So, as it happens, the Chaos Dwarfs conveniently had this raging desire to enslave and dominate lesser races. As we've talked about before, the Greenskins are amongst the most ubiquitous, omnipresent races on the planet. They are everywhere, and expeditions for the sole purpose of capturing and binding a new slave workforce began in earnest. With their command of technology and sorcery, it was a simple thing to bring the various tribes surrounding the Darklands to heel, and in short order, they had a gigantic number of Greenskins to do their bidding. But the Dawi Zharr were vastly outnumbered, and Greenskins, especially goblins and their variants, are notoriously treacherous. So how do you rule and control an unruly populace and force them to do your bidding? Well, if you're the Chaos Dwarfs, you rule with a brutal iron fist, immediately crushing any hint of rebellion in the most grotesque and painful ways possible. Sacrifice was already an important component of Chaos Dwarf society. It was necessary to bind and summon demons, it was necessary to please Hashut, and it was a core component of sorceress rituals. Rebellions were quashed with brutal efficiency. The ringleaders burned to a crisp in forges but kept alive through dark magic, slowly dipped into cauldrons of molten gold, or eaten alive by hungry, malevolent spirits of fire and metal. It didn't take long for many of the Groby to realize that the crack of whips and languishing in the smoke-filled factories of the capital was preferable to the torturous executions that awaited them should they rebel. And so, over the centuries, the Chaos Dwarfs used these slaves as sacrificial commodities, expending them in the way we use water or tools. Without slaves, Naggrund would not have been built, and its vast industries would not have been maintained. That isn't to say there were never rebellions, plotting, and scheming on the part of the Greenskins to escape. In the far east, past the mountains of Morn where the Ogre Kingdoms reside, on the massive rolling plains of the steppes, is one of the largest Greenskin empires in existence, comprised entirely of hobgoblins, a subspecies of Groby almost as tall as a man and known for their treachery. These hobgoblins came to be an important component of the Chaos Dwarf Empire. Essentially, the dwarfs needed more numbers loyal to their cause and desired slavers on the inside. So they made a pact with the hobgoblins, the most distrusted and vicious of goblin kind, and employed them as slave overseers, lackeys, and even as frontline soldiers, providing utterly disposable reinforcements for their own forces, enabling a larger enemy army to be weakened without cost in Chaos Dwarf lives before they themselves moved in for the kill. Hated by the other Greenskins who would happily murder them if they could, the hobgoblins of the Darklands came to rely on the Chaos Dwarfs for patronage and protection. And while they are incredibly eager to betray each other for advancement, they're quite incapable of fomenting any cohesive rebellion against their brutal masters, as they cannot even trust each other, making them in some ways the perfect slave. But even with the Hobgoblin Pact, the Dawi Zharr desired ever more control, and set in motion plans to create the perfect workforce. They grew wary of the constant animosity and infighting of their slaves, and wanted pure, unthinking obedience and loyalty. With the aid of dark magic, and the selection of the largest and strongest of the Greenskin slaves, they magically bred the first black orcs into existence. The experiment was a complete catastrophe. Their attempts to create a more disciplined Greenskin slave force only made them the perfect leaders for their brethren to rise up and topple their empire. The magical abilities of the dwarf sorcerers could never erase the strong sense of independence that all orcs possessed, and when the Greenskins rose up in rebellion, the great uprising that followed almost led to the complete destruction of their entire empire yet again, making it as far as the doors of the Temple of Hashut, at the pinnacle of Naggrund, at the beating black heart of the Chaos Dwarf Empire. It was only the timely betrayal of the hobgoblins from the Greenskin cause, those who had initially rebelled alongside the Black Orcs, that spared the dwarves from their complete and utter annihilation. In doing so, the hobgoblins earned the hatred of the other green races, who deeply distrust them still to this day. Although many of the Black Orcs were killed in the fighting, some escaped, crossing the blasted waste and spreading throughout the World's Edge Mountains, where their numbers multiplied. The experiment, understandably, was never repeated, and slowly, steadily, the Chaos Dwarfs replenished their numbers, growing in reach and power, acquiring new slaves, and squashing ogre and greenskin incursions before they could gain momentum. But the greenskins aren't the only slaves they took. Ogres were frequently sought after for their sheer strength and capacity for violence, so they were used as part of artillery crews as loaders and muscle on the field of battle. Humans were a rarer sight in Naggrund and the factories around. Obviously, they were much more intelligent than greenskins or ogres, but were considerably less durable. And Skaven, well, the Dawi Zharr realized early on that Skaven were bad news as slaves. Captured Skaven often intentionally carried plague and disease into the midst of slave camps, decimating their populations, so the Dawi Zharr pretty much adopted the dwarfs' outlook on Thagaraki: kill them on sight. The worst tortures and sacrifices were saved for their cousins to the west. Any captured dwarfs met with grisly ends and rituals to the Father of Darkness as recompense for the ancestor gods they felt had abandoned them so long ago. The dwarfs, as you would expect, generally don't even recognize their existence, and those who do, like Thorgrim Grudgebear and some of the lore keepers, dream of righting those extensive wrongs, but typically focus on more reasonable goals, like the colonization of ruined holds and re-establishment of the everlasting realm. Expeditions into Uzkalak in modern times would be incredibly foolish, even with all their number gathered in a gigantic throng with Ungrim and Thorgrim and the White Dwarf at the helm. An invasion of the Great Skull Land would likely be the ruination of the dwarfs, which of course isn't necessarily true in the combined campaign for Total War Warhammer. I'm sure we're going to be seeing lots of dwarf players colonizing Naggrund and Skaven Blight and burning their hated enemies out of their fortresses once those become available on the playable map. But lore-wise, it would be an absolute disaster trying to invade Naggrund or even the Darklands in general. But that's true on the flip side as well. The Chaos Dwarfs hold grudges in the exact same manner, and to them, there's no race on the planet worse than those who worship Grimnir, Grungni, and Valea. But they most certainly could not invade Karazakorak or Karak Kadrin by themselves. They just don't have the numbers, even with their massive hordes of slaves. The interactions between these two races are actually really interesting. In those rare quotes from the army books and novels, there's this tangible sense of bitterness that the Fire Dwarfs truly and utterly felt betrayed by the other clans. Here are a few examples. Where was Grimnir when our warriors were dying? Where was Valeo when our children sickened? When we called out for aid in the deep places where we delved, it was not Grungni who answered our call, but mighty Hashut, who delivered us in our time of need. Who are the real traitors here? Our kin, who abandoned us to madness and death, or we, who only sought to survive against the forces of chaos? One day, there will be a reckoning, and it will be the sons of the Father of Darkness who will have the victory, not the weak-willed spawn of the pathetic ancestor gods. You may curse us, shun us, deny our existence, but that is no matter. You have done so for centuries. Had you not abandoned us, our vast family would never have been sundered. Thanks to your cowardice, we are strong and mighty, seeing the truths that have long been hidden from dwarf eyes. I find those quotes really interesting because you get this sense that they wish things hadn't been this way. They truly were kin and family to the World's Edge Mountain clans, and that they felt some sense of loss it's been replaced by hatred over the centuries. I think that makes the grudges they hold against each other all the more powerful. There's nothing worse than being betrayed by those you actually care about. And then to have that sense of betrayal twisted around and turn into a very, very ugly cancer that consumes every waking hour of your life for hundreds of years. It's basically what Hashut did. Gave his people the ability to sustain themselves off of pure hatred, which is a blessing and a curse all rolled into one seriously screwed up religion. We've covered a lot so far, but two topics we need to discuss before we move on to military tactics, strategy, and implementation in Total War Warhammer are how the Chaos Dwarfs exert influence across the vast plains and lava flows of their homeland, and delve a little bit deeper into what demon smiths and sorcerers are all about, because they play a huge role in their society, as I previously alluded to. So Zharr Naggrund is the capital city of the Chaos Dwarf Empire, and really it's their only city. It's gigantic, pitch black, forged of obsidian, and layered like the ziggurats of ancient Mesopotamia. That's the heart of their empire. But the Darklands are gigantic. It's way too much land to control properly with only a single city, even one as powerful as the Tower of Fire and Desolation. So over the long years, the Chaos Dwarfs built fortresses for their legions throughout their homeland, connected by roads that allowed quick reinforcement from one tower to the next. The most famous of which became the Twin Peaks, the Tower of Gorgoth and the Black Fortress. While Gorgoth stood over some of the richest mineral deposits in the Darklands and served as a heavily garrisoned mining outpost, the Black Fortress stood as a purely military citadel, home to the Infernal Guard and sorcerer prophet Drazoath the Ashen. This character will very likely be the first legendary lord choice from the Chaos Dwarfs come to Total War Warhammer, considering he is literally the only named character in the most recent Chaos Dwarf Armybook, in Tamurkhan, Throne of Chaos. He is the commander of the Legion of Asgore, which is one of the most powerful armies in all of the Darklands, and wields devastating fire sorcery and melee prowess in equal measure. The problem for him is that he was exiled to the Black Tower a long time ago, and although he is their undisputed ruler and commander of a very potent military force, it's situated very far away from Zharr Naggrund and the home of the Sorcerer Priest, so he doesn't quite have the amount of influence he wants, which is pretty interesting because despite being the most recent and well fleshed out Chaos Dwarf character, he isn't technically their faction leader unless they introduce him after a coup or something just after he takes power in the campaign, which I guess is entirely possible, but in the army book, he hasn't taken over as the primary leader of their race. That's in part due to the fact that there is no primary leader or High King of the Chaos Dwarfs. The oldest and wisest of the High Priests of Hashut wield considerable power, but that power is split between the couple hundred that are still alive. So I'm very curious how Creative Assembly decides to handle Chaos Dwarf government. We'll talk a little bit more about that and Drazoath the Ashen in a little bit as well. The Sorcerer Priests and Demon Smiths are the other topic I want to cover before we get into military tactics and army compositions. So as I stated earlier, they are the ruling class in Chaos Dwarf society. Much like the Dawi Zharr themselves, they are very few in number. Only a couple hundred exist, and they all wield considerable influence over politics, government, and military matters. And the reason for that is that they are the most capable, the wisest, and the most able of all their race. They forge the weapons, the war machines, the armor, and the arcane devices used to conquer nations and keep slaves in line. The strongest and wisest of the elite are the Sorcerer Prophets, of which there are only a handful still alive. The Sorcerer Prophets were present during the Great Catastrophe when Chaos threatened to overwhelm their Cax, and they were the ones that oversaw the initial construction of Zharr Naggrund, bound as they were to the will of Hashut. They are ancient and malign beings, and pay a heavy price for the power they wield. So, essentially, dwarfs were never meant to be able to wield magic in the way that elves and humans could. It simply wasn't a part of their physiology. It isn't to say they weren't attuned in some ways. I mean, that's why they're able to use rune magic, but they could never wield the different winds and fashion spells in the same way the elves and humans could. That changed when the Father of Darkness became their patron god. All casters of the Lore of Hashut have a curse upon them, that as they use magic, over time their body turns to stone, starting at the extremities and working its way up the body until they become completely petrified. This process takes generations upon generations and will eventually kill you, of course. For the wisest of the Sorcerer Priests who do not delve into desperate or poorly fashioned spells, the curse still hasn't completed its journey yet, even millennia later. The road to Zharr Naggrund is lined with the statues of hundreds of former sorcerers who cast too often and too greedily and were completely overcome by the blessings and curses of their god. Which in layman's terms means you have plot armor if you're an important Chaos Dwarf character, and if you aren't, you get turned to stone by your casting or eaten by one of your demonic summons. So the Lore of Hashut is unique to the Dawi Zharr. As I mentioned earlier, it shares some similarities with the Lore of Fire, but there are some major differences as well, especially in the amount of direct damage abilities. Let's talk about how it would translate from tabletop into Total War Warhammer. Killing Fire is the lore attribute, which would probably be implemented as a map-wide passive that buffs flaming damage. Breath of Hatred is the signature augment spell that could pretty easily be translated to grant Frenzy, and overcasting it would make this effect AoE, but you could also make it a simple plus 34 melee attack buff in an area of effect as well. Burning Wrath is a magic missile that can split into smaller missiles and hammer the front of an infantry line. In my mind, it'd be a bit like Skarsnik's Prodder ability, and designed as a counter to massed infantry formations, but hopefully perform a little bit better than that, because in my experience, Skarsnik's Prodder is pretty much trash every time I've used it. Dark Subjugation is a big area of effect leadership debuff that synergizes extremely well with the terror-causing units they can field, and there are a lot of them. We'll be talking about those demonic summons and some of the other terror-causing units that Chaos Dwarfs bring to the battlefield in a little bit. And it can actually permanently decrease leadership of target units for the duration of a battle. So that's interesting. There aren't very many spells currently in Total War Warhammer that are a permanent debuff. Usually it's just plop the spell down, and then that debuff will last for 30-40 seconds, and then it'll disappear. In this case, they could make it so that it's permanent for the rest of the battle, which would be pretty interesting. Obviously, there'd have to be some balancing that goes on there, but it would be a nice touch on CA's part. Curse of Hashut is another spell. It's like Spirit Leech, a single target direct damage spell that causes bones to petrify and flesh to grow brittle and crumble to dust. Ash Storm is an AoE hex debuff that lowers melee attack and accuracy of units caught inside the radius, and can actually prevent units from charging or flying as well. I'm not sure we'll get to see it perform exactly like that, but it would be a really nice touch if grounded flying units couldn't take off if they were caught inside the middle of an Ash Storm. And it'd also be pretty cool if it was able to stop or slow down charging units. Not like Net of Ammontok, which would literally root a charging enemy and prevent them from escaping, but seeing it stop a charge once they entered the AoE, and then force them to run back around and wait for the debuff to disappear before trying to charge in again, that could be a pretty awesome area denial ability or spell that I think would be pretty cool and unique. Hellhammer is a direct damage spell that works in a straight line on the tabletop, but I imagine it more like a wind spell. It's not quite a direct damage spell. I think it would be very similar to how Penumbral Pendulum works, as this fiery hammer that drops from the sky and pounds through the flank of a unit. And it's interesting because the Lore of Hashut actually has 3 direct damage spells, so I feel like CA might need to get a little bit creative in how they differentiate them, which I'm kind of trying to think of right now. And finally, Flames of Asgore is a direct damage spell that kind of works like a vortex in that it scatters and moves in a random direction after you cast it. The interesting thing here is that it can be cast from anywhere on the battlefield. You don't need to be within range to use it. So it would be, I believe, the only spell currently in Total War Warhammer that has no range whatsoever. Which, again, sounds OP, but when you're talking about like a 20 or 24 Winds of Magic spell that is functioning like a vortex, depending on how CA handles those as we move forward in the trilogy, it might not even be that good a spell. So it would still be nice to be able to see you able to cast that spell from across the map. Like, in my mind, as soon as the game starts, you could point and click on the enemy army and basically cast the vortex. And like Flamestorm, it's just kind of this big wandering ball of fire and lava and death, but on tabletop is actually quite a bit scarier than Flamestorm from the Lore of Fire. So I think some of those ideas there could help differentiate the spells a little bit. I mean, they're straight from the tabletop, and just a question of whether Creative Assembly wants to actually implement and differentiate those spells from the Lore of Fire. I feel like they'll have to if they want to make sure that people can tell there's even a difference between the two lores. It's a very versatile lore of magic, but can only be fielded by Sorcerer Prophets, your Lord level casters. But now let's get into what I would think is a lot of people's favorite part: military tactics, strategy, and how that all fits into the Total War Warhammer battlefield. What makes the Chaos Dwarfs unique? and how do they play differently from other factions. I mean, it should be pretty obvious from the lore we've already covered, but the Chaos Dwarfs are characterized by their massive resistance to fire damage, and their ability to dish flaming damage out. If you're the Wood Elves, you do not want to rock with the Tree Spirit army against these guys. You will burn absolutely horribly. If you're playing as the Tzeentch Demons or Warriors of Chaos faction, you do not want to face the Dawi Zharr. You're going to do no damage whatsoever. Believe me, flaming attacks do nothing to them. They're going to laugh in your face as your army is sent screaming to face the Changer of Ways. Those two particular matchups are pretty much auto-lose if Creative Assembly does the Chaos Dwarfs justice. But there aren't a lot of Chaos Dwarfs. They're few in number and typically considered quite elite, heavily armored, well-equipped, and very well-trained. The Contempt special rule from Tabletop means they take 0 morale penalties from routing friendly units unless those units are Chaos Dwarfs or Bull Centaurs. Considering those units in particular are Leadership 9 and Leadership 8 respectively, and all their Dwarf units are characterized by very high leadership, they do not route easily at all. So the chain routing that occurs amongst the slaves and hobgoblins that form your meat shields will, justifiably so, have no impact whatsoever on your more important troops. And this is very important, because most Chaos Dwarf armies have a front line that functions a lot like Skaven meat shield tactics. You send in the slaves in waves, they die in droves, they die horribly, soak up fire, maybe get a bit of that friendly fire going on, that hilarious stuff that you see with the Skaven armies all the time, while you blow apart the enemy line, and then you laugh maniacally as everything is burned to a cinder. They actually share some similarities with Clan Scryer in that way. They have this overwhelming range firepower with little care if there's a bit of collateral damage, or a lot for that matter. I mean, they're just greenskins, right? There's only a couple million more where those come from, so not a big deal when the hobgoblins and the greenskin slaves die in droves. Once the slaves are routed or dead, the Hailshot, Blunderbuss, and Fireglaves open fire, which, combined with the rest of the devastating artillery they're known for, is 9 times out of 10 going to force an engagement on their terms, as enemies are vastly outranged and overpowered from afar, and are forced to close the gap and get into melee. Once that happens, the Infernal Guard and Ironsworn wade into melee, clad head to toe in black shard armor that's pretty much immune to fire damage, and with some of the best armor values in the trilogy, a lot of them upwards of 110, 120 armor, Chaos Dwarfs are going to be very hard to cut down in melee. But that's only, those Ironsworn and those Infernal Guard and stuff are only going to have to wade into melee if there's much left to still kill in melee once it's all said and done. I mean, the Dreadquake Mortar and the Iron Demon War Engine are capable of unleashing devastation on a level not seen yet in this trilogy from afar. They will be amongst the most powerful and the most expensive artillery pieces and war machines in all of Total War Warhammer. I'm talking one shot, entire units obliterated and transformed into red mist. I know we've already had some discussion about it in Sleepy's Chaos Dwarf mod, talked about it in some of my replays, but his implementation is honestly not very far off from what I want to see in terms of damage output and overall balance. An extremely expensive, very slow reload weapon of mass destruction that is dodgeable and snipeable with magic missiles or cannons, but when it successfully impacts in the middle of a unit, absolute unyielding carnage is what I want to see. It just doesn't care if you have armor or not, whether you're expensive or not, whether you're sexy or not, you're gonna get turned into tomato paste if the Dreadquake Mortar lands an artillery strike in the middle of your unit. They might sound a bit like the Dwarfs in terms of playstyle once you get past that Horde Slave tactic a little bit, but there's one more layer to Chaos Dwarf tactics that I haven't touched on too much in this video, but will be covered even more in depth once we get to the army roster in a little bit. They have monsters, a lot of super cool ones that provide that last level of differentiation that really sets them apart from the other races in Warhammer Fantasy. You've got the holding power, the heavy armor, and the badass looking infantry the dwarfs have, but on top of that you have terror-causing, cannonball-shooting, steam-belching train engines, a giant variant with gigantic swinging scythes hanging off its arms, half-mutated centaur cavalry, flying flaming bulls that vomit lava, and gigantic fire spirits forged in raging hot metal, ready to charge in screaming from the flanks. Seriously, what is there to not love about this faction? Their army roster is unbelievably cool. High leadership, high armor, terror-causing units abound, and very expensive special and rare choices bolstered by hordes of undisciplined greenskins that basically just are meant to go in and die. And that's what you should expect to see when you field the Chaos Dwarfs in campaign or multiplayer. Your campaign start in Total War Warhammer 3, which is when I'm expecting them to be implemented, will be pretty unique. There's only one major race further east than you, the Ogre Kingdoms in the Mountains of Morn, and taking them out early will be a pretty big priority, I think, because once you've killed them and taken over their encampments in the Mountains of Morn, you have a map edge to your back and can expand in any direction you want without worrying about your flank at all. There will be tons of Hobgoblin and Greenskin tribes around the Darklands, but your settlements should provide a really stable base of income and operations with which to expand into the World's Edge Mountains. Mount Goodbad will be a high priority for the Brightstone Mine and 1500 income per turn, and from there, you can look to expand southwards towards Black Crag and Dawi Zharr. Hopefully, by that point, we'll have Nagash in the game, so you'll have a major threat from the south to spice things up a little bit, but I can honestly see it being one of the easier campaigns just because of your location and economic base. It's a bit like starting as the Chosokabe in Shogun 2, with their great farms and geographic position shielding them from being surrounded and attacked from multiple sides. The question is, how will public order be implemented for the Chaos Dwarfs? I've never been a huge fan of these gigantic public order penalties that were like in Attila as a way of slowing down the player. I don't think it's personally fun to sit in settlements from 10 to 15 turns with an army waiting for public order to stabilize. It really just doesn't add much to the game except a fake kind of challenge that shouldn't really be there. No one wants to sit in a settlement for 10 to 15 turns with a full stack and not be able to fight battles. It's just not a good game mechanic. But frankly, maintaining control over slave populations is an important part of empire building with the Dawi Zharr, so using Infernal Castellans or Bull Centaur Toruks to put down insurrections might play a large role in their early campaigns. Slavery undoubtedly will be some kind of gameplay mechanic implemented for the Chaos Dwarfs, just like I'm expecting it for the Dark Elves, but we'll have a much better idea about how Darkland slavery will play out once we get to see how it works for the Dark Elves in Total War Warhammer 2. One mechanic in particular that I really like to see, that I don't think has ever been in a Total War game before, is the ability to become an arms dealer for factions, particularly the Norskins and Warriors of Chaos if you so choose. So in the lore, the Chaos Dwarfs make a crap load of money and gain a whole bunch of bad boy clout with the ruinous powers by selling them weapons like hell cannons and fire glaives and serving as mercenaries in their armies. The Northmen and Warriors of Chaos don't really have the patience or the skill to create siege weapons like the Chaos Dwarfs can, and some of their armor comes from the Darklands as well. Just as a quick aside, it is important for me to mention that the Fire Dwarves consider themselves as separate entities and frankly consider themselves above the ruinous powers. They don't worship any of the four main Chaos gods and find it insulting when they're conflated with Khornate warriors, for example, but the ability to create units like hell cannons or Chaos Siege Giants and sell them on the diplomatic screen for serious cash or favors from other factions would add another dynamic to the admittedly pretty boring and vanilla diplomatic system we currently have. Adding a bit more complexity certainly wouldn't be a bad thing because it fits Chaos Dwarf lore perfectly and would make the whole diplomacy system a bit more interesting and in-depth, I think. And it would also possibly lead into mercenary factions like the Dogs of War or Southern Realms being able to sell their services to the highest bidder and fight in other factions' battles, which would be such an incredibly cool game mechanic and a fun way to make loads and loads of money. Imagine recruiting Leopold's Leopard Company and then being able to go to the Empire in the diplomacy screen and say, hey, want some badass mercenary pikemen dressed in leopard skin? Sure, pay me a lot of gold, and then we'll talk about it. I think that would be an incredibly cool mechanic for Southern Realms or Dogs of War, but of course that kind of mercenary system could work for some other factions like the Chaos Dwarfs as well. Now in terms of Legendary Lords, Drezoat the Ashen I think is the one guaranteed Legendary Lord we'll see once their faction goes live, considering he's the only named character in their entire army book. Much like the other casters in the army, he's immune to psychology. After all, not much would scare you when you've lived in the heart of darkness, surrounded by horrifying monstrosities since the Great Catastrophe. He buffs war machines in the same way that dwarf engineers currently do in Total War Warhammer 1, and like the other sorcerer prophets, has the Sorcerer's Curse, the same one we talked about earlier that slowly turns them to stone as they cast. This means that miscasts are particularly damaging to him because they'll turn his extremities into solid rock, but I really don't think this special rule is particularly important in terms of Total War Warhammer. I just don't think that having your Legendary Lord KO'd whenever RNGs feels like being a dick would be a particularly fun game mechanic. I think CA should want to shy away from anything that relies so heavily on RNG that it can actually punish your Lord severely if it kicks in a lot. So, yeah, in tabletop, miscasts are worse for Chaos Dwarf Sorcerers, but I don't think that needs to be implemented so much in the actual game. Dark Renown demonstrates his clout and ability as a high-ranking general, and could be translated as a passive that buffs melee attack in a similar manner to Thorgrim's High King ability, but it would only work for Chaos Dwarf units, not for their slaves. He has 3 magic items that make him pretty badass. The Hell Shard Amulet, a talisman that grants him a 15% ward save, and reflects damage back at attackers, so anytime he gets attacked, he could trigger some kind of debuff or damage aura around him that would also deal it back to the attacker in a percentage basis. The Demon Spite Crucible grants a large increase to Winds of Magic Pool and recharge rate, while also granting bonus damage when attacking enemy casters. And the Graven Scepter, which would essentially make him hit like a truck in melee, gives him high armor piercing and weapon damage in general, maybe raises his melee attack as well. He also has a unique mount named Cinder Breath, a Bale Taurus that has a passive area of effect health drain special rule called Blazing Body that essentially would make him function like a flying Mortis engine in a way, which sounds ripe for abuse, honestly. Sounds pretty crazy, but I'd be interested to see how CA decides to handle that. It is one of his special rules on the tabletop. I feel like a flying Mortis engine style aura could be abused really heavily in multiplayer or something like that, but regardless, Bale Tauruses are pretty scary, especially because they also have a breath weapon that would be very similar to the Sun Dragon ranged attack we saw at the Battle of the Fallen Gates. They cannot be wounded by flaming spells under any circumstances, so in fact, if a Lore of Firecaster shot a fireball at a Bale Taurus and it got hit by it, it would actually heal the Bale Taurus, which I think is pretty hilarious. I would love to see complete immunity or even healing effects from enemies if they cast flaming spells at the Bale Taurus. I think that'd be a really nice touch. Now, Drazoath the Ashen's campaign bonus would unquestionably revolve around Infernal Guard, who form the bulk of his army at the Black Tower, so lower upkeep, lower recruitment cost, and a red line tree that gives Infernal Guard serious buffs to attack, defense, and armor would be pretty standard fare for his campaign. As you can probably tell, Drazoath is a very versatile lord with a great mount choice that, like Archaon or Malekith, fills the role of both melee beast and powerful caster all in one character. He basically was given everything because there weren't any other named characters in the army book, but really I don't think he'd have to be toned down or have abilities stripped away, even when other characters get added, because we know there will be more than one legendary lord for the Chaos Dwarfs. Just because something sounds OP on paper doesn't mean they will actually be OP in the final game. I think Archaon the Never Chosen is a prime example of that, of course, but I still think he's likely to get some more buffs at some point relatively soon as well. But after Drazoath, the question becomes who should be the second legendary lord. Looking through the even older army books, there are a couple that could possibly make the cut, but I'm just going to focus on the one that I think will make it in. Zatan the Black, commander of the Tower of Zharr. He'd be the melee-focused lord starting in Zharr Naggrund, while Drazoath starts in the Black Tower to the southeast. He's essentially the lead general in service to Gorth the Cruel, the most powerful of the Chaos Dwarf sorcerers alive, but we're not going to get Gorth because he has very little lore written about him, and his curse is very advanced. All of his extremities are pretty much rock solid now, so he can't really move or walk or do much of anything but watch and move the chess pieces behind. So the relationship between the two is a lot like Finnebar and Tyrion. Gorth is the dude behind the scenes, like I said, moving the chess pieces because he can't do anything physically, while Zatan is on the front lines, bringing slaves back and winning glory for the Empire. He's one of the greatest slavers in history, exceptionally cruel, even for a Chaos Dwarf, and he has a very hands-on approach with the whipping, torturing, and sacrifice of those under him. He can ride a Taurus or a Lamassu, which we'll talk about very soon once we get to the army roster portion of the video, which is only going to be like a couple seconds from now, and can carry up to 4 magical items thanks to his being so tight with the ruling class and the powerful sorcerer cast in Zharr Naggrund. It's a pretty interesting dynamic between the two lords, honestly, because Drazoath is probably more powerful overall than Zatan the Black, but doesn't have the support of the Zharr Naggrund ruling caste in the capital, while Zhatan commands a very powerful army as well, but starts in the most important location in the Darklands, in the capital itself. So, in a 1v1, Drazoath would probably beat the absolute crap out of Zhatan, but he doesn't quite have the political clout or the fantastic start position that Zhatan has. So if either one of them wants to truly rule the entire Chaos Dwarf Empire, they're going to have to step over some elite dwarf corpses to make that happen. And now, 45 minutes in to the army roster of the Dawi Zharr. A very flavorful and diverse selection of units from thunderous, devastating artillery to flaming metal demons. When we finally get our hands on them as a playable faction, a lot of us are going to want to use Chaos Dwarf units themselves. We already have Greenskins, and yes, they will play a role in the army for sure, as slaves and hobgoblin cutthroats, but CA isn't going to treat it like a lore where it's thousands and thousands of screaming hobgoblins and slaves with only a handful of Dawi. No, it's not going to cut it, even though lore purists might prefer that approach, so I think CA will treat them like the regular dwarfs. Yes, their race is in decline, as are so many other races in Warhammer Fantasy, but you'll still be able to field full armies with them if you so choose. As we move through these models, and I talk about each of the units in their army book, I want you to take notice of their aesthetic. Obviously, some of their models are much older than others, but you'll notice that some of them have a Babylonian or ancient Mesopotamian feel going on, with the big hats and the dreads, and then other units like the Infernal Guard are turtled up in that black shard armor and look more like walking tanks. I'm curious how you all want CA to handle that. Would you prefer if they took the Call of Warhammer route, where basic Chaos Dwarf warriors wear the big hats while the Infernal Guard and Ironsworn have the black shard look? Or would you prefer if CA just goes for the newer Infernal style and skips out on all the Babylonian stuff? Or vice versa? I personally want a mix of both, because I think it does a good job differentiating the units and offers a lot of flavor and diversity when you've got those two different styles going on. But there's also something to be said for a more uniform look to go with the army, and some people might not feel like the two aesthetics work that well together, that they clash a little bit. I'm curious what you guys think, so let me know. But now on to the units themselves. Chaos Dwarf Warriors aren't technically in Tamurkhan, the Throne of Chaos army book. It's actually just the page that explains the special rules and stuff we've already covered. But a basic level Chaos Dwarf unit seems incredibly likely, so I'm going to cover them like they'll make it in, even though they might not, just because they're not technically in the army book. But similar style to the Dwarf Warriors, they're the main line, relatively cheap infantry with great morale, good mass, good armor, and cost efficiency. Now when I say relatively cheap, in comparison to Dwarf Warriors, I'd say they're probably a bit more expensive, maybe closer to Longbeards in price, and a bit stronger in melee as well. But yeah, definitely pretty strong for a quote-unquote vanilla or low-tier unit for the Chaos Dwarfs. Now remember, there's no real low-tier Chaos Dwarf unit, but these are the basic guys, and I do expect to see them in Total War Warhammer 3. Remember, they do not care whatsoever if friendly slaves are routing near them, so they cannot be chain routed or take morale penalties from the pussy greenskins that make up their front ranks. So I expect there will be a shielded version for them, a great weapon version for them, and a hail shot blunderbuss version. And these things, I love these things. They're super exciting because they're one of my favorite units in Call of Warhammer Beginning of the End Times, and they're essentially, they kind of function like a shotgun, a very old shotgun packed with lead balls that can deliver a devastating punch at close range. Each shot from the hail shot would have a chance to hit multiple enemy targets and could completely level an enemy infantry charge in a good volley. Remember what the Donderbus Cav could do in Shogun 2? Absolutely brutal from very short range, but you had to get in range, and that of course makes you very susceptible to getting charged by Cav or by enemy infantry. I don't expect it to be quite as strong as it was back in Shogun 2 in terms of gameplay, but the shorter they make the range, the more powerful CA can make each volley and further differentiate it from the gunpowder units that we already have existing for the other factions. And as you would expect, they'd be armor piercing. It's a shotgun from close range. It's going to devastate even heavily armored troops. It's just going to be a lot of fun to try out. So if you're on the other side of the field, use meat shield tactics. Make sure they can't get a good volley off into your armored or expensive units, or you're going to get punished very heavily. The Infernal Guard are the warrior caste of the Black Fortress, forming the bulk of the Legion of Asgore and form Drazoath's personal army. They are the Chaos Dwarf equivalent of Slayers, but perform a dramatically different battlefield role, where of course Slayers are very unarmored and fast. The Infernal Guard are more of that frontline tanky troop that can wade into melee and just slaughter everything and take a lot of damage. Essentially, if you screw up in any way as an artisan, if your furnace blows up or your weapon sucks, as a slaver, if your slaves rebel and beat the crap out of you, as a military commander, you lose a battle or you're related to someone who lost a battle, or as a fighter, you poop your pants in combat, you lose a duel, or do something embarrassing in front of a sorcerer prophet, you undertake the Westerosi equivalent of taking the black and heading to the wall. Except instead of putting on a black cloak and taking a vow, you're encased head to toe in black shard armor and have a searing hot mask welded to your face, granting you anonymity and solace from your dishonor. The difference between Infernal Guard and Slayers or Crows, though, is that Infernal Guard can win glory on the battlefield, and in so doing can earn the right to have the mask torn off and rejoin the world with their name and title restored. Only this time, they're savagely ugly because their face was half burned off in the whole process. They have extremely high armor, approaching Ironbreaker status, because apparently being dipped and quenched in the blood of innocents and demon things makes for greater levels of protection when we're talking about armor, and they're highly resistant to flaming attacks as well. And they can use Fire Glaives, a very cool looking armor piercing repeating handgun that also doubles as a halberd in close quarters combat, which is a pretty big deal. It's essentially a higher tier unit that doubles as a powerful skirmisher and AP melee troop, a lot like the Lothern Sea Guard for the High Elves, but more elite and a lot more heavily armored as well. Just a bit angrier too. You wouldn't be a happy camper with a burning mask sitting on your face. There's also an ensorcelled hand weapon variant that deals magic damage in melee, and overall it's just a super cool unit that I think will be a lot of people's favorite mainline infantry for the Dawi Zharr. The Infernal Ironsworn are the bodyguards of the upper echelon figures in Zharr Naggrund, and they're essentially, to regular Infernal Guard, what Chosen are to Chaos Warriors. Just a bit scarier, a bit beastlier, and a more expensive version of the Infernal Guard. Hobgoblins, as we talked about earlier, are a bigger and more treacherous version of Goblin, with a gigantic propensity to backstab and betray one another. They're known as cutthroats and sneaky gits, as they prefer to loot long, curved blades from the battlefield with which to murder unsuspecting enemies. In a straight-up melee fight, they're garbage. They can't be expected to do much of anything except die, but they do gain serious morale bonuses from being near Infernal Guard or Bull Centaur units. They gain bonus damage when hunting down routing units, and have a special rule called Hobgoblin Animosity, which demonstrates their likelihood of turning on each other even in the middle of a fight for their lives. Essentially, on the tabletop you roll dice, and depending on the roll, you either take an immediate panic test as they attempt to get a better view from the back of the battlefield, they act normally as they realize they have an actual chance to win the battle and cut them good, or their murderous nature takes over amongst themselves and they take damage and lose a few models but gain additional damage for a 30-second period. That could be an RNGesus implementation from Creative Assembly, but that isn't typically how CA likes to design their unit mechanics, so I'm honestly kind of at a loss to how CA could implement it. They might just skip it altogether, or have to completely change the way the rule works for it to get put in the game. Hobgoblins can also be mounted on wolves and used as raiders and light cavalry used for scouting and harassing enemy skirmishers, with a Cowardly Despoiler special rule that gives them additional melee attack if they successfully attack the rear or flank of an enemy, but they lose melee attack if they're charged or engaged from the front. And that basically demonstrates that they're pretty scared of fighting anything in a straight up melee fight, as they should be. They're super low armored, super low morale, not good for much of anything except running down enemy skirmishers. But yeah, there are a ton of Greenskin equivalents already in the game in Total War Warhammer 1, so I'm not going to spend too much time talking about them. But now we can start getting into the really good stuff, the terrifying monsters and apocalyptic artillery that makes this faction so unique. Bull Centaurs are monstrous beasts that combine the movement speed of cavalry and the brutal intelligence and sentience of the Dawi Zharr themselves. They're bigger, stronger, and faster than any of the Chaos Dwarf infantry, and they're also a lot angrier. The sacrifice of many slaves goes directly into their hungry mouths, and that's one of the few things that temporarily cools their rage. They cause fear and are resistant to missile fire with a scaly skin ward save, and they're just a super terrifying looking unit. Unquestionably a step up from the other centaur unit that we currently have in the game, the Centaurs of the Beastmen roster. These are the Kadai, of which there are a few variants, and I seriously love these guys. They're super awesome to look at. But the Fireborn are demonic elementals similar to the lesser demons of each Chaos God, but where there are likely millions of demons howling in the warp, waiting for their chance to enter the mortal plane, only a relatively small handful of Kadai exist at any given time. So these are essentially equivalents to the Bloodletters, the Demonettes of Slaanesh, the Plague Bearers, those kind of things. The secret to their binding lies with the High Priest of Hashut, who created this almost mindless elemental army from magma and demonic slavery fused in cauldrons of boiling blood. The Chaos Dwarfs don't like summoning uncontrollable demons with ideas and ambitions of their own. Obviously that can lead to some pretty tragic and ridiculous consequences. Pretty understandable there. So the Kadai are the result of binding beings from the warp into metal and weaponry and armor, where they essentially become slaves, rather than having their own temporarily corporeal body free of Chaos Dwarf control. Every single Kadai unit has a small blazing body aura that deals damage over time, deals flaming attacks, is essentially immune to fire damage, can't take damage from fire whatsoever, and has 20% physical resistance on top of that. On tabletop, they also take damage over time if they fail their toughness tests, as the fire sorcery that binds them essentially consumes itself. So it's kind of a weird discord with the Chaos Dwarf artillery units, which want as much time to fire as possible before units close into melee. But the Kadai want to get into melee as soon as possible before they crumble away. So those two don't really synergize particularly well, and I'd imagine that might have been problematic on the tabletop for some Dawi Zharr players. The Kadai Destroyer has all of these same special rules. It's on the left in this picture, but is the greater demon Kadai for all intents and purposes, a gigantic creature of scorching metal and raging magma that causes terror, and gains frenzy. These are constructs shaped like bulls or dragons or rhinocs, and they're known to their enemies as dark colossi that can smash through walls or gates and breathe fire. They are absolutely terrifying. There was unfortunately no Forge World model ever fully finished and created for them, so today we'll hopefully get a behind-the-scenes look at what some artwork and unreleased models look like, and give us something really special, because it has the opportunity to be one of the coolest looking monsters in the entire trilogy. Now, this is an old model, an admittedly ridiculous looking model of a Lamassu, plucked straight from ancient Assyrian myth and dropped into the wonderful world of Warhammer. You know, Games Workshop is always so creative with their monster choices. They're weird looking, super freaky, with the head of a human, body of an ox, and wings of a bat or a dragon. And if something gets cut from the Chaos Dwarf roster, I think they might be pretty high on that list of potential disappearances. But if done right and updated properly, they do fit perfectly with that older Chaos Dwarf aesthetic with the Sumerian twist. The cool thing about them is that they're actually attuned to the winds of magic. They're casters in their own right, and they can manipulate humans or other animals to do their bidding with a strange and powerful charisma before luring them to their deaths. So I can't think of another mount in Warhammer Fantasy that is a straight up Lore of Shadows or other lore of anything caster that can straight use spells themselves. I can't think of very many. Now this is from older editions, obviously. It's not in Tamurkhan Throne of Chaos, I don't believe, but it's a really weird unit. I wouldn't mind seeing it at all if Creative Assembly can do it justice. It would be pretty fun to use for sure. And this is the Baal Taurus. They are the pinnacle of Chaos Dwarf mounts, reserved only for the mightiest of the Sorcerers of Hashut. They never die, except through battle or murder, as the flames within them are sustained and kept burning by their patron god. They're one of the few flying options the Chaos Dwarfs have, and actually are not that fast for a flyer. They only have movement speed 6, which I believe is the same speed as Forsaken Infantry, so relatively fast, just not that fast for a flyer. But they make up for that by being that flying mortis engine of terror. They have that aura that debuffs enemies in a big area of effect, does that damage over time, and generally they just smash things up in melee combat as you'd expect a gigantic flaming bull would do. There is no other monster in the world that evokes the true form of the Father of Darkness quite like a Taurus, and so it holds special significance in Naggrund and throughout the Darklands. very few can hope to ride them without being utterly incinerated and burned to ash. The Chaos Siege Giant is a horrific monstrosity that's been tortured and experimented on before being sold to the highest bidder. Creative Assembly's dream unit here, because my lord, do they have a fetish for giant variants. We already have so many, but that's also kind of true for Warhammer Tabletop in general. With all that said, this is by far one of the coolest giant variants we're going to get to see. They are mutilated monstrosities with armor literally heat welded and nailed into their bodies, which frequently kills them, duh, but for those who don't die, they're kept alive by runes of hate that make them go insane and berserk, and the weapons tethered to their bodies allow them to smash through gates and walls incredibly easily. And I think this would be the first monster in the game actually able to smash through walls. Frankly, I would have loved if CA had gone a step further with siege interactions, allowing monsters like Kolek to smash through walls with Starcrusher, or for ethereal units to walk through walls to attack unsuspecting units, Goblin Spider Riders to be able to climb over walls, that kind of thing. But I really do want to see CA give this giant its due, which would mean allow it to attack walls, not just the gate. And it's very heavily armored, which will be very nice because one of the biggest issues giants have that they currently face in the multiplayer meta is that it's so easy for a handful of enemy skirmishers to focus fire them down and just murder them in seconds because of their inherent lack of mobility and their lack of armor. And armor will help a lot with not dying incredibly fast to enemy skirmishers. And the Dreadquake Mortar is one of those set piece units that I just cannot wait to see brought to life. Look at how gigantic that thing is. That's an ogre loading it, and the ogre looks tiny. It's literally sitting on part of a humongous train that's needed to carry it into battle. And this thing brings the pain. They're fired by gathering steam pressure, as conventional gunpowder could easily set the unique and deadly dwarf shells off inside the barrel, which would kill the crew itself. So it fires super slow, and in Total War terms, probably has a reload speed of roughly a minute or longer, so it would take a long time to shoot. But it completely annihilates blobs of infantry or any formation it happens to catch flush with a good shot. The perfect weapon for siege battles too, where units are caught in narrow streets or in melee around gates and towers that naturally funnel them into a very compact area, and its raw killing potential in those situations will be amongst the most satisfying things we'll get to see in the course of all three games. Cannot wait to see the Dreadquake Mortar in action. And if you want a taste of it, go check out Sleepy's Chaos Dwarf mod. It is glorious to behold. The Magma Cannon is a lot like Flame Cannon, originally designed for use against trolls and other regenerating monsters in the Darklands, but gradually saw more use as the Chaos Dwarfs expanded outwards into new territory. There's no one blueprint for it. While the dwarfs of the Kara's Anchor typically like to find what works and perfect it over generations, making sure it is the perfect blueprint that all other artillery pieces afterwards can use, the Chaos Dwarfs are a bit more experimental, and each Demon Smith has their own way of doing things that turn these into absolutely brutal killing machines that spew molten hot lava designed to scorch and incinerate enemies. But no two look or act the exact same. And now we get to arguably the most iconic and coolest piece of tech in the entire Chaos Dwarf arsenal. The Iron Demon War Engine, a nightmarish steampunk creation that far surpasses anything the Empire could ever come up with, even the steam tank. It is a literal steam-driven tractor from hell that comes with two variants, a twin-barreled steam cannonade that blasts shrapnel shot into enemy formations, or the Skullcracker, a mobile battering ram with whirring hammers and spinning blades designed to smash through walls, gates, or cover and keep rolling without stopping. And that's not just lore, that's how it works in the tabletop as well. Smashes through cover and keeps going. So imagine using that in one of these siege battles where they smash through a wall in one go and then just start ripping through anything and everything in melee while the rest of your army rushes to the breach. This is the ultimate siege weapon right here. And that's not even talking about the really cool part. It has a special rule that allows you to attach other artillery pieces to the war engine, forming a huge steam train of devastating cannons and mortars that can quickly move throughout the battlefield. From a gameplay perspective, would it actually be that useful in the grand scheme of things? No, probably not. Most maps are small enough that artillery can reach the enemy deployment zone, so you don't have to worry too much about moving your artillery around, and you just have to create a big armored box around it and protect it that way, which the Chaos Dwarfs are very good at doing. But from a fun perspective, I can think of few things more awesome than a steampunk train set of death rolling throughout the map, firing huge artillery strikes as it goes. Please, Creative Assembly, do it for us. Let us attach deadly war machines to our beautiful, terror-causing iron demons so we can roleplay Thomas the Train Engine from hell. It's going to be so much fun. Please. They're so cool, man. I love them. Do it for us. By the way, all Chaos Dwarf artillery could have a special activatable ability called Hellbound that increases their armor-piercing damage, but could cause misfire damage to the crew. Not sure we're going to get to see that. It really just depends if Clan Scryer and the Skaven get misfire chances with their weapon teams and artillery. If they don't in Game 2, I feel like there's no way in hell the Dawi Zharr will in Game 3. Miscasts on artillery aren't the biggest deal, but I think they will add some nice flavor, especially for Skaven stuff. So we'll see if CA decides to handle it that way. The Deathstreaker rocket launcher is kind of like the Hell Cannon and comes in two variants, one designed to break apart and follow up with minor explosions, and the other designed to impale large monsters. So just like the bolt throwers for the elves, one's good for infantry, one's good for cav and killing big scary things. Like the Hell Cannon though, it fires raging, shrieking spirits bound to hellfire, and these malevolent entities give off a pretty big morale penalty when they hit a target. So I'm talking substantial leadership debuff when it gets near or hits a enemy unit. And finally, the heroes. Demon Smiths, Infernal Castellans, and Bull Centaur Taurochs. Nothing incredibly special amongst any of them. The Demon Smiths are like Drazuath in their ability to buff war machines and artillery while simultaneously functioning as casters. So they're like a runesmith and a master engineer all rolled into one with the lores of death, metal, and fire. So they're pretty badass, but they're very similar to how Drazuath functions. They're just a hero version. They can't use the Lore of Hashut though. That is important to remember. That's saved only for Sorcerer Prophets, which are your Lord level casters. The Bull Centaur Tauroch is just a big mean Bull Centaur, same way a Gorbull is to a Minotaur, beast in melee, and the Infernal Castellan is a beefed up Infernal Guard. They are infantry commanders and essentially fill the role of a drill sergeant. They can also be upgraded to carry great weapons or fire glaives, so that would be a lot of fun if we could customize their skill tree a bit and choose a ranged loadout or a more melee focused one. But that, my friends, is the lore and army roster of the Chaos Dwarfs, how I think they should be implemented in Total War Warhammer, the unique mechanics introduced alongside the faction, and the units and lords we can expect to see. This one kicked my ass a little bit, I'm not gonna lie. I mean, these lore, army, and tactics videos always take a while to put together, but this one was especially brutal. Pulled a couple all-nighters and put in a lot of research beforehand trying to get this one all worked out, so hopefully it was worth it, and you found it at the very least educational, if not downright enjoyable. Big thanks to Scion of the Emperor for his patronage and support on this video. It probably would have been many more months before I got around to the Chaos Dwarfs if he hadn't suggested it. Remember, I'm always open to suggestions for videos, love interacting with you guys, but if there's something specific you want me to cover ASAP, not just in terms of Warhammer content, but historical stuff as well, best way to do that is to donate and get in touch with me through Patreon. I take that stuff seriously, for real, like those are my clients, I take that stuff serious. But huge thanks to anyone who clicks on, comments on, rates, and enjoys my videos. That's all I expect, that's all I need, and I really, really appreciate any kind of support you give me, whether it's just clicking like, whether it's just clicking on the video at all, and enjoying my content. YouTube has been a blast for me. Hopefully with Warhammer 2 and some of those other games coming out near the end of the year, we can take it to the next level and really ratchet up the quality of content. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to give it a comment and a like. Really helps out the channel, and let me know what you think of the Chaos Dwarfs, how they should be implemented, and what units you're most excited to see as we approach Game 3. First, we have to let the Skaven get introduced and actually get our hands on Game 2. Going to bed, it's way too late or early, as the case might be, but I'll see you next time. Indypride, signing out for now.